Is locking the knees in yoga poses a bad idea? For the answer, stay tuned. Many yoga students have the habit of locking their knees when they practice poses. And indeed, some styles of yoga and some yoga teachers encourage students to lock the knees. Now, first of all, what does it mean to lock the knees? It means to kind of push the kneecap back in toward the knee, fully extending or really hyperextending the knee joint. Now, many people do this automatically in their everyday life. You will look at teenagers kind of hanging around the mall. Typically, they're leaning all their weight into one leg, hyperextending that leg. Now, in fact, when you hyperextend, it makes it easier to stand because your muscles don't have to engage and you can let the ligaments around the joints support your weight. The funny thing is that many people have the attitude that if they're not fully straightening the legs, they're not working fully in the pose. For example, in downward facing dog pose, really pushing the knees back toward behind you, fully engaging the legs, contracting the quadricep muscle, for example, really hard to drive the knees back, fully extending the leg. Paradoxically, that's just the opposite of what's true. Because when you have the knees slightly bent or even deeply bent, the muscles surrounding the knees need to work much harder to keep you in position. You're no longer leaning into your ligaments as you do when you're hyperextending, locking the knees back, but in fact causing the muscles on the leg to have to work and therefore get stronger. So the thing I have discovered, because I've now come to this position where I no longer think it's a good idea to push the legs so strongly back, but instead maintain at least a micro bend in the knees when we're doing poses. Now, I don't recommend this for the reasons you might suspect. Now, I've heard it said that it's dangerous for the knees to hyperextend them, that somehow that if you hyperextend them, you're going to lengthen the ligaments over time and the knees may become unstable. But as I look around the world, I see people hyperextending their knees all over the place in daily life, not just in yoga classes, although I see it plenty in yoga classes as well. Okay, but the point is that people do it all the time, and as far as I can see, people do it without any problems for long periods of time. So I'm not really convinced those biomechanical reasons why we shouldn't hyperextend the knees unless you've got some problem that might make it an issue. But for most people, I don't think that's a big concern. Where I have my problem is energetically. Specifically, what I'm talking about is that the prana doesn't move through the body as well when the joints are rigid. The Chinese like to say that the qi gets stuck in the joints, and I believe the same thing is often true in yoga. There needs to be a suppleness, a flexibility, a slight change in the pose between the inhalation and the exhalation, which when you're rigidly holding your knees back is not happening. And say you're hyperextending the front knee in triangle pose, Trikonasana. Now you might think that that's just about the leg. But if you hold the pose with the knee hyperextended, you'll notice that you can't bring as much breath into the side ribs, that they're kind of locked down. The intercostal muscles can't fully expand and contract with the breath as they like to do. So the lack of keeping flexibility in the knees by hyperextending the knees affects the breath. It affects the nervous system because when the breath can't fully move, that's agitating to the nervous system. And I believe it interferes with the flow of prana and the structural integrity of the pose itself. Now that's a longer topic and it'll have to be the subject of a future video. But in the meantime, at least put a micro bend in the knee. And by the way, a micro bend in the knee sometimes is just bringing the knee from hyperextended to straight. So we sometimes say, bend your knee until it's straight. So there's a koan for you. Okay, all for today. Namaste. Take care.